February 19, 1945. As American landing crafts approached the black volcanic shores of Iwo Jima, Japanese commanders knew they were about to fight a battle they couldn't win. What they didn't know was that this small island, barely 8 square miles, would become the graveyard of Japan's military confidence and the beginning of the end. This is the story of how defeat at Iwo Jima shattered an empire's illusions and forced a nation to confront an impossible truth. The Battle of Iwo Jima stands as one of the most brutal confrontations in the Pacific theater of World War II. Between February and March 1945, over 70,000 American Marines assaulted this strategically vital island, defended by approximately 21,000 Japanese troops. The resulting 36-day battle would claim nearly 7,000 American lives and virtually annihilate the entire Japanese garrison. But beyond the staggering casualty figures lies a deeper story, one of psychological devastation, military desperation, and the slow, agonizing realization within Japan's leadership that their empire was collapsing. Understanding Japan's reaction to this defeat provides crucial insight into the final months of the Pacific War and the mindset that would eventually lead to Japan's surrender. This wasn't just another lost battle, it was a turning point that exposed the futility of Japan's defensive strategy and accelerated the internal debates about the war's inevitable conclusion. Before the storm, Japan's strategic dilemma. By late 1944, Japan's military situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The once mighty combined fleet lay shattered after defeats at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. American forces had recaptured the Philippines, and B-29 Superfortress bombers were beginning to strike the Japanese homeland from bases in the Mariana Islands. Tokyo itself had experienced its first air raids, shattering the myth of Japan's invulnerability. In this context, Iwo Jima held enormous strategic significance for both sides. For the Americans, the island would provide emergency landing fields for damaged bombers and bases for fighter escorts to accompany bombing raids over Japan. For the Japanese, Iwo Jima represented an outer defensive ring, one of the last barriers before an inevitable American assault on the home islands. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, appointed to command Iwo Jima's defense, understood the impossible nature of his assignment. A realist among romantics, Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in the United States during the 1920s and harbored no illusions about American industrial might. In his letters to his family, he wrote with unusual candor, "Do not expect my return." He knew that reinforcements would never come and that victory was impossible. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had given Kuribayashi clear instructions: delay the Americans as long as possible. Every day Iwo Jima held out was another day to prepare defenses on Okinawa and the home islands. The strategy had shifted from winning battles to making each American victory so costly that perhaps, just perhaps, the United States might negotiate a conditional peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi implemented a radical defensive strategy that broke from traditional Japanese military doctrine. Gone were the suicidal banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles. Instead, he ordered his men to construct an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions throughout the island's volcanic rock. His soldiers would fight from concealment, inflict maximum casualties, and sell their lives as dearly as possible. Every man understood they were expected to kill at least 10 Americans before dying. The mood among the Japanese garrison was fatalistic but determined. These soldiers represented a cross-section of Japan's remaining military strength. Veterans hardened by years of combat alongside raw conscripts barely out of training. They knew the strategic situation, they understood that Japan was losing the war. Yet the code of Bushido, combined with intense military indoctrination and genuine patriotism, meant that surrender remained unthinkable. They would fight to the death because that's what was expected, what was honorable, and what their families and emperor demanded. In Tokyo, the atmosphere among Japan's leadership was increasingly desperate. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso's government clung to fantasies of negotiated peace, while military hardliners insisted that Japan could still achieve a decisive victory that would force favorable terms. Emperor Hirohito, meanwhile, remained publicly silent but privately concerned. The sacred narrative of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Meiji Restoration, was crumbling with each territorial loss. The battle, a descent into hell. When American Marines stormed ashore on February 19, 1945, they initially met lighter resistance than expected. Some dared to hope for an easier fight. That hope evaporated within hours. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold fire until the beaches were packed with Marines and equipment. Then the hidden guns opened up. What followed was 36 days of the most savage fighting in Marine Corps history. The terrain itself was treacherous. Volcanic ash that swallowed men to their ankles, sulfurous fumes from the island's volcanic activity, and virtually no natural cover. The Japanese defensive positions proved nearly impregnable. Bunkers that appeared destroyed would suddenly erupt with gunfire. Tunnels allowed defenders to appear, attack, and disappear like ghosts. As reports filtered back to Japan, the initial accounts emphasized the fierce resistance. Japanese propaganda radio broadcasts celebrated the defenders' heroism, portraying Iwo Jima as evidence that American forces could be stopped, that the cost of invading Japan itself would be prohibitive. State-controlled newspapers ran stories about individual acts of sacrifice and bravery. But behind the propaganda, Japanese military commanders received grimmer reports. Kuribayashi's communications grew increasingly desperate. American flamethrowers were systematically destroying defensive positions. Naval bombardment pulverized fortifications. Marine infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, methodically advanced despite horrific casualties. The general's messages conveyed what everyone already knew but couldn't publicly acknowledge: the garrison was being annihilated. By early March, Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima recognized that the battle's outcome was inevitable. Communication with the island became sporadic as American forces overran radio positions. Kuribayashi's final messages were stark and honorable. He apologized for his inability to defend the island more effectively. He praised his men's sacrifice. He prepared for a final stand. The raising of the American flag atop Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's legendary photograph, sent shockwaves through Japanese leadership. This image, widely distributed within days, symbolized more than the capture of one position. It represented American determination, overwhelming force, and the inexorable march toward Japan itself. Japan's reaction, facing the unthinkable. The fall of Iwo Jima on March 26, 1945, triggered profound reactions across Japan's military and political hierarchy. The official response maintained the propaganda line. Kuribayashi and his men were heroic martyrs who had inflicted devastating casualties on the Americans. And indeed, the statistics were sobering from an American perspective. Nearly 7,000 killed and over 19,000 wounded, making Iwo Jima one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. But privately, Japanese commanders confronted a devastating reality. The Americans had accepted horrific casualties and still prevailed. If this was the price they were willing to pay for an 8-square-mile island, what would they sacrifice to conquer Japan's home islands? The answer was terrifying to contemplate. Among the troops stationed throughout Japan's remaining territories in the home islands, news of Iwo Jima's fall deepened the prevailing sense of doom. Soldiers understood military realities better than civilians. They knew that Japan's air force was virtually destroyed, that the Navy existed only as scattered remnants, that fuel and ammunition were running critically short. Iwo Jima's loss meant American fighters could now escort bombing raids all the way to Tokyo. The war was coming home. Junior officers, particularly those who had witnessed combat in China, the Philippines, or other Pacific islands, experienced a growing disconnect between the military's public pronouncements and observed reality. Many had adopted Kuribayashi's fatalistic determination: if defeat was inevitable, at least die honorably. But this was a far cry from the triumphant confidence of 1941 to 1942. The Imperial General Headquarters faced internal divisions that would intensify in the coming months. Hardliners, led by War Minister General Korichika Anami, insisted that Japan should fight to the last man, woman, and child. They believed that by making an invasion of the home islands prohibitively expensive, Japan might still extract conditional surrender terms that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. Moderates, including Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, recognized that continuation of the war would lead only to Japan's complete destruction. They began quietly exploring possibilities for mediated peace, though these efforts remained tentative and constrained by fear of being accused of defeatism, a charge that could result in assassination by military extremists. Emperor Hirohito occupied an extraordinarily complex position. Constitutionally sacred and politically constrained, he maintained public silence while privately expressing increasing concern. Iwo Jima's loss reinforced his growing belief that the war must end, but traditional protocol prevented him from directly intervening in military decisions. Not yet. Among ordinary Japanese soldiers awaiting deployment or stationed on other islands, Iwo Jima became a symbol of expected fate. They would fight, they would die, and the outcome would ultimately be the same. Some found solace in this certainty, embracing the samurai ideal of honorable death. Others experienced profound despair, caught between duty and the recognition that their sacrifice served only to postpone the inevitable. For civilians on the Japanese home islands, the government's propaganda couldn't entirely mask the truth. The increasing frequency and intensity of American bombing raids spoke louder than official statements. Families who had lost sons, brothers, and fathers in previous battles now faced the probability that more would die in the defense of Japan itself. The mood in cities and towns combined defiance, resignation, and quiet terror. The American perspective. Victory's heavy cost. While this story centers on Japan's reaction, understanding the American perspective provides essential context. The Marines who fought on Iwo Jima experienced some of the war's most intense combat. They witnessed courage and fanaticism that challenged their assumptions about warfare. The Japanese refusal to surrender, even when defeat was obvious, even when seriously wounded, disturbed many American veterans. Admiral Chester Nimitz's famous statement that uncommon valor was a common virtue on Iwo Jima applied to both sides. American commanders recognized the effectiveness of Kuribayashi's defense. They understood that if this resistance could be replicated on larger islands like Okinawa, and especially on the Japanese home islands, the final phase of the war would exact an almost unimaginable price. This realization influenced American strategic thinking in profound ways. The casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, ranged from conservative estimates of 200,000 American dead to more pessimistic projections exceeding 500,000. These numbers would ultimately influence President Harry Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. From the American perspective, Iwo Jima proved that despite overwhelming material superiority, defeating Japan would require either genocidal levels of combat or some alternative that would force capitulation without invasion. The island's fall was strategically necessary and tactically successful, but the cost raised profound questions about how to end the Pacific War. Aftermath. The road to surrender. In the months following Iwo Jima's fall, Japan's situation deteriorated with accelerating speed. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, repeated Iwo Jima's pattern on a larger and even more horrific scale. American forces again prevailed, but Japanese resistance again proved ferocious. The death toll climbed. American, Japanese military, and Okinawan civilian casualties combined exceeded 200,000. For Japan's leadership, each defeat narrowed available options. The Soviet Union's Neutrality Pact, which some Japanese leaders hoped might lead to mediated peace, would expire in April 1946. But Stalin had secretly agreed at Yalta to enter the war against Japan. When Soviet forces invaded Manchuria on August 9, 1945, this final blow shattered any remaining hopes for negotiated peace. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9 forced the ultimate crisis. Even then, Japan's leadership remained divided. Hardliners wanted to fight on, proposing a national suicide defense of the home islands. Moderates argued that continuation meant the complete annihilation of the Japanese people and culture. Emperor Hirohito finally broke his silence, making the unprecedented decision to personally intervene in the government's deadlock. His recorded address announcing surrender, broadcast on August 15, 1945, cited the new and most cruel bomb, but the decision had been building for months. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the relentless bombing campaign, the Soviet invasion, each had contributed to the inescapable conclusion that further resistance served no purpose beyond national suicide. For the soldiers and commanders who had defended Iwo Jima unto death, the emperor's surrender broadcast would never be heard. They had become martyrs to a lost cause, their sacrifice ensuring only that the war lasted a few months longer. Whether their resistance was heroic dedication or tragic waste depends on perspective, but its futility was absolute. What do you think drove Japanese soldiers to fight with such determination despite knowing the war was lost? Was it genuine belief in their cause, military indoctrination, cultural concepts of honor, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of history's most complex questions, and I'd love to hear your perspectives. The Battle of Iwo Jima exposed the terrible arithmetic of the Pacific War's final phase. Japan could inflict horrific casualties. Japanese soldiers could fight with almost incomprehensible determination. But material superiority, strategic advantage, and industrial capacity would inevitably prevail. The only question was how many would die before the inevitable conclusion. For Japan's military leadership, Iwo Jima represented the moment when rationalizations finally collapsed under the weight of reality. The island's loss didn't cause Japan's defeat. That outcome had been determined by earlier strategic disasters and America's overwhelming advantages. But it crystallized the impossibility of Japan's situation in ways that even propaganda couldn't obscure. The human cost of Iwo Jima, American, Japanese, and in subsequent battles civilian, stands as testimony to war's terrible waste. Nearly 28,000 casualties to secure 8 square miles of volcanic rock. But those casualties represented more than statistics. They were sons and brothers, fathers and friends. They were young men who died fighting for their countries, their comrades, and causes both noble and misguided. Studying battles like Iwo Jima reminds us that war's reality differs profoundly from its mythology. Courage exists on both sides, sacrifice transcends national boundaries, and the human capacity for both extraordinary valor and tragic futility finds expression in the chaos of combat. If you found this historical deep dive valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about understanding the human experience in its most extreme circumstances. By studying the past, we gain perspective on the present and perhaps wisdom for the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.